Welcome. Find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey back 500 years to an age when the world's true shape remained a mystery, when oceans stretched beyond any mapmaker's imagination, and when a voyage of discovery meant accepting that you would very likely never return home. Tonight, we explore the first circumnavigation of the globe, a 3-year odyssey that began with 5 ships and 270 men, and ended with 1 battered vessel carrying just 18 survivors. You'll experience life aboard these wooden worlds crossing endless waters, witness the dramatic events that led to Ferdinand Magellan's death on a distant shore, discover how Renaissance sailors navigated without knowing where they were going, and glimpse the vast colonial trade network their suffering helped create. But first, imagine yourself in the year 1519, standing on the docks of Seville. Before you lie 5 ships preparing for departure. You've signed on as a common sailor, drawn by promises of riches and glory. You cannot yet know that this decision will likely be the last you ever make. The ships creak gently against their moorings. The smell of tar and salt water fills the air, and you step aboard, leaving behind everything familiar, stepping into a world of unimaginable hardship. Let us begin. Your new home is a vessel, perhaps 75 feet long and 20 feet wide. You are one of roughly 50 men assigned to this ship, though the fleet's flagship carries more, and the smallest vessel carries fewer. Stand on the deck for a moment and understand what this means. Every inch of space serves a purpose. Barrels of water and wine lash to the rails. Coils of rope occupy every corner. The ship's boats nest on deck. Chickens cluck in wooden cages. Pig snuffles in its pen. And somewhere among all this, you must find a place to sleep. Most sailors sleep on deck when weather permits, wrapped in thin blankets, pressed against their shipmates for warmth. The fortunate ones claim a spot near the forecastle, where an overhang provides minimal shelter. Others bed down near the mainmast, or along the rails, or anywhere they can wedge themselves against the ship's constant motion. When storms approach, when rain begins to fall, you retreat below deck into the hold, a dark, airless space that reeks of bilge water, where you crouch among the cargo, your head bent. Beneath low beams, listening to water seep through the planking above, you learn quickly that privacy does not exist. You relieve yourself by climbing out along the bowsprit, balancing above the waves, exposing yourself to spray and wind and the very real possibility of falling. There is no bathing, no changing of clothes beyond what seawater provides during storms. Your woolen garments grow stiff with salt and sweat. Your skin develops sores from the constant chafing. The smell of unwashed bodies becomes so pervasive, you cease to notice it, though you never quite forget. The rhythm of your days establishes itself within the first week. You work in watches, 4 hours on duty, 4 hours of rest, around and around without end. During your watch, you might stand at the rail, scanning for land or danger. You might climb the rigging to adjust sails, your bare feet gripping tarred lines, the ship rolling beneath you, the deck impossibly far below. You might man the pumps, for every ship leaks constantly, and the bilge water must be expelled, or the vessel will grow heavy and sluggish. You might scrape barnacles, splice rope, mend sails, or perform any of 100 tasks that keep a wooden ship alive on the open ocean. And then there is the food. At the voyage's beginning, the provisions seem almost adequate. Each day you receive your ration. 1.5 pounds of hardtack, the ship's biscuit baked so hard it can crack teeth. A measure of wine, perhaps half a liter, sometimes supplemented with water. On lucky days, cheese or salted meat. On Fridays and holy days, dried fish or beans. The ship's cook, if you can call him that, prepares hot meals when possible, using a firebox carefully tended on deck. Though rough seas often make fire too dangerous, and you eat your rations cold, the hardtack presents its own challenges. These thick biscuits, baked months before the voyage began, harbor weevils. Small dark beetles burrow through the dense bread, leaving tunnels and droppings. You learn to tap your biscuit against the table before eating, watching the insects fall out, or simply to eat in darkness where you cannot see what you're consuming. Some men claim the weevils add protein. Others insist you should soak the biscuit in wine to drown the creatures first. You develop your own method and try not to think about it too much. As weeks become months, the food deteriorates. The salted meat, packed in barrels, begins to spoil despite the salt. You fish out pieces that have turned gray and soft, their smell acrid and wrong. The ship's stores of beans develop weevils of their own. The cheese grows a fur of mold that you scrape away before eating what remains. The water in its wooden casks becomes cloudy, then greenish, then begins to smell of decay. You drink it anyway, for there is nothing else, adding wine when possible to mask the taste and kill whatever lives in it. By the time you've been at sea for 3 months without landfall, which happens crossing the Pacific, that vast ocean whose scope Magellan drastically underestimated, the food situation becomes desperate. The hardtack runs low. You're placed on reduced rations. 3/4 of a pound of biscuit per day. Then half. The meat barrels contain only bits of gristle swimming in foul-smelling brine. You fish out pieces and force them down. The rigging, you discover, includes leather fittings, strips, and pieces used to join wood and rope. Someone realizes this leather, though tough as wood from sun and salt exposure, is technically edible. You cut small pieces, soak them in seawater for days to soften them slightly, then char them over the firebox until they're blackened. The result is almost chewable. Almost. It provides something for your stomach to work on, even if it offers little nutrition. You develop a system. Soak, char, chew for hours until the leather breaks down enough to swallow. Your jaw aches constantly. And then the rats. The ships teem with rats, those inevitable passengers who board every vessel. Normally you curse them, chasing them from the stores, trying to minimize the grain they consume. But as starvation approaches, the rats become valuable. Some enterprising sailors set traps. The going rate reaches half a ducat per rat, an astonishing price. You watch men haggle over dead rodents. The rats are skinned, gutted, and roasted whole. The meat is dark and stringy, but undeniably meat. You tell yourself it's no different from rabbit. You almost believe it. It begins subtly. You feel more tired than usual, though you attribute this to the general hardship. Your gums become tender when you bite into hardtack. Then they begin to swell, growing soft and spongy. Old scars that cut on your hand from 2 years ago, that wound on your shin from childhood, begin to ache, then to open, seeping fluid. Your teeth feel loose in your jaw. You wiggle one with your tongue and feel it shift. You watch it happen to others first. A man who seemed healthy enough yesterday cannot leave his sleeping spot today. His legs have swollen, covered in dark bruises that spread like spilled ink. His breath comes in gasps. The ship's surgeon, hardly worthy of the title, can do nothing. Some men recover slightly when the ship makes landfall and fresh food becomes available. Others do not. They die quietly, their bodies sewn into canvas and slipped over the side with a brief prayer, disappearing into water so deep their descent continues long after they vanish from sight. The weather provides no mercy. Sailing south along the coast of South America, approaching the strait that will eventually bear Magellan's name, you encounter storms that seem designed to tear ships apart. The waves grow to monstrous heights, green and gray mountains of water that lift the vessel up, and possibly high, before dropping it into troughs so deep you cannot see the other ships. Wind tears at the sails with a sound like cannon fire. Rain drives horizontal, each drop stinging like a thrown pebble. During these storms, you work in a state beyond exhaustion. All hands on deck, clinging to lines, hauling on ropes with fingers too numb to feel. The ship heels over at angles that seem impossible, water rushing across the deck, trying to sweep you away. You hook your arm through the rigging and hold on, knowing that if you let go, if you're washed overboard, the other ships won't even notice your absence until the storm passes. And by then you'll be miles behind, drowning in water so cold it stops your heart within minutes. Some men do wash overboard. You see it happen a figure there one moment. On the next, not even time to scream, the ship sails on. At Port St. Julian, partway down the South American coast, something breaks in several of the captains. They've endured months of hardship. The promised Indies seem no closer. Some begin to question whether Magellan knows where he's leading them, whether this passage to the west even exists. Whispers of mutiny spread through the fleet. The mutiny, when it comes, is swift and almost succeeds. 3 ships' captains coordinate, seize control of their vessels, and demand Magellan turn back. But Magellan, sleeping aboard his flagship, learns of the plot and responds with calculated violence. His loyalists surprise one of the rebel ships at dawn, killing the captain and seizing control. Faced with superior force, the other mutineers surrender. Magellan's punishment is methodical. The ringleader is executed. You watch as he's drawn and quartered, his body divided and displayed as a warning. Another captain is marooned, left on shore with a priest, given minimal supplies, and abandoned when the fleet departs. You never learn their fate. The other conspirators are put in chains, forced to labor at the pumps and the hardest tasks. The fleet remains at Port St. Julian for months, preparing ships and waiting for better weather. And the executed captain's remains stay on display the entire time, a constant reminder of the cost of disobedience. You understand, watching this, that you are wholly in Magellan's power. There is no authority higher than his, no court of appeals, no possibility of rescue. You sail at his command, or you die. It's remarkably clarifying. The passage through the strait proves as harrowing as promised. The channel twists between rocky cliffs, narrowing and widening unpredictably. Strong currents pull at the ships. Wind funnels between the mountains, shifting directions without warning. You drop anchor frequently, send boats ahead to sound depths, and scout the route. Progress measures in miles per day, sometimes less. One ship, exploring a side channel, simply disappears, whether wrecked or deliberately sailed back toward Spain. You never know. The fleet continues with 4 vessels. And then, finally, you emerge into the ocean. Magellan names Pacific for its apparent calm compared to the strait's fury. You cannot yet know that you face a crossing that will take 98 days without sight of land. You cannot imagine the suffering still ahead. You adjust the sails, set the course west by northwest, and settle into the routine once more. The Pacific crossing becomes a blur of identical days. The sun rises, traces its arc, sets. The stars wheel overhead. The waves roll endlessly in all directions. You see nothing but water and sky for weeks and months. The food deteriorates. The scurvy spreads. Men begin to die with increasing frequency. You develop a sort of numbness, a mental callous against the suffering. You perform your watch duties automatically. You chew your ration of leather without tasting it. You no longer bother to pick the weevils from your biscuit. You sleep when you can, dreamless, exhausted sleep that never quite refreshes. You exist in a state somewhere between living and dead, waiting for either landfall or the final relief of death. When land finally appears, the islands that will become known as the Marianas, you almost cannot believe it. The shapes on the horizon might be clouds or exhaustion-induced hallucinations, but they solidify, become undeniably real, and the ships turn toward them with desperate eagerness. The natives who greet you paddle out in swift canoes, bringing food and water, fresh fruit, vegetables, fish. You eat carefully, knowing your stomach has forgotten how to process real food, but even so, you become violently ill. Many men do, but it doesn't matter. You're alive. You've survived the Pacific. Of course, you don't yet know that more than half the fleet's remaining crew will die before reaching Spain again. You don't know about the battles ahead, the betrayals, the final desperate voyage westward after Magellan's death. Right now, in this moment, chewing fresh fruit that makes your scurvy-damaged gums bleed, feeling the sun on skin that has become as leather itself, you simply exist in the overwhelming relief of having survived. The rhythm of life aboard ship continues. The watches rotate. The sails require constant adjustment. The pumps must be manned. But now, with regular landfalls as you work through the Philippines archipelago, the desperate edge has lifted. Food becomes available. The dying slows. You almost dare to believe you might survive this voyage. You clean yourself in a freshwater stream for the first time in months, watching the water run brown with accumulated filth. You eat rice and meat that isn't rotting. You sleep on land, feeling the earth beneath you, instead of the constant rolling motion that has defined your existence for so long. And you begin to remember what it felt like to be human, rather than a creature whose sole focus was survival. But the voyage is far from over. Ahead lie battles and betrayals, political entanglements, and fatal decisions. The worst may be behind you in terms of pure physical suffering, but new dangers approach. You cannot see them yet, standing on a beach in the Philippines, but they're coming nonetheless. For now, though, you rest, you eat, you let your body begin the slow process of healing, and you prepare, without knowing it, for the next chapter of this extraordinary, terrible journey. The islands you've reached, this sprawling archipelago of green mountains rising from turquoise waters, represent a complexity you didn't anticipate. These are not the empty lands of sailors' tailies, nor the hostile territories where survival means constant vigilance. These islands are densely populated, politically intricate, and caught in their own web of alliances and rivalries that have nothing to do with European ambitions. You are about to become entangled in conflicts you don't understand, led by a commander whose judgment has grown clouded by months at sea and an increasingly fervent religious mission. Magellan's fleet arrives at the island of Hominhan on March 16, 1521. The reception is cautious, but not hostile. Local inhabitants approach in boats, offering food in exchange for trinkets. You've learned by now that red cloth, bells, and small mirrors hold extraordinary value in places where such items remain rare. The exchanges proceed smoothly. You acquire coconut strange fruits that require careful instruction to open, and fresh fish, rice, and fruits whose names you don't know, but whose taste makes your eyes water with relief. The expedition moves on, island to island, establishing a pattern. Magellan sends boats ashore to meet local leaders. His interpreter, Enrica, a slave he acquired years earlier in Malacca, and who may be the first person to actually circumnavigate the globe by returning to his homeland, facilitates communication. The conversations follow a predictable structure: greetings, exchanges of gifts, discussions of trade, and increasingly, discussions of faith. Magellan has always been devout, but the voyage seems to have intensified his religious conviction. Perhaps the survival of the Pacific crossing struck him as divine providence. Perhaps the deaths of so many men weigh on his conscience, requiring spiritual justification. Whatever the reason, he becomes increasingly focused on converting the people he encounters, as though spreading Christianity might retroactively sanctify all the suffering. On the island of Cebu, you arrive at a significant port, a trading hub where vessels from throughout the region gather. The ruler here, Raja Humabon, commands real authority. His settlement is substantial wooden houses on stilts, a busy marketplace, boats of various sizes crowding the harbor. You can see this is a place of consequence, connected to trade networks that stretch across these islands and beyond. Magellan approaches the Raja carefully, following protocol. Gifts are exchanged. The Raja sends food to the ship's pigs, chickens, rice, fruit, in quantities that seem almost overwhelming after the scarcity you've endured. In return, Magellan offers European goods: knives, cloth, mirrors. The Raja appears pleased. Relations develop warmly. Then Magellan begins to press the matter of conversion. You watch this unfold with growing unease. Magellan doesn't simply offer Christianity as one option among many. He insists upon it with increasing fervor. He arranges demonstrations of European technology firearms discharged to show their power, men in armor displaying their equipment. He speaks of the Christian God's supremacy, the protection offered to converts, the eternal consequences of refusal. His tone contains an edge that wasn't present in earlier encounters. Remarkably, Raja Humayun agrees to convert. Whether from genuine spiritual interest, calculated political advantage, or simply a desire to maintain good relations with these strange visitors, the Raja accepts baptism. A mass conversion follows hundreds of people, including the Raja's family, receiving baptism in ceremonies that blend Catholic ritual with what you suspect is incomplete understanding on both sides. You participate in building a large cross that is erected prominently in the settlement. Magellan seems energized by this success, speaking of the souls saved, the expansion of Christian territory. But you notice that not everyone shares the Raja's enthusiasm. Some locals observe the proceedings with expressions you cannot read. The political dynamics of these islands remain opaque to you. Who holds power? Who resents whom? Which alliances run deep, and which are merely superficial? Magellan begins involving himself in local politics with a confidence that strikes you as dangerous. He offers to support Raja Humayun against his enemies, to use European military superiority to establish the Raja's dominance throughout the region. The Raja mentions various rival chiefs, including one named Lapu-Lapu, who rules a settlement on the nearby island of Mactan. Lapu-Lapu has refused both Humayun's authority and Magellan's demands for tribute and conversion. This refusal seems to obsess Magellan. He speaks of teaching the chief a lesson, of demonstrating Christian power, of securing Humayun's position. His officers express concern. The men are still recovering from the Pacific crossing. Engagement in local conflicts wasn't part of the expedition's mission. The situation's complexity makes prediction difficult, but Magellan dismisses these objections. A small force of European soldiers, he insists, can easily overcome any number of native warriors. On April 27, 1521, Magellan leads an expedition to Mactan. He takes about 60 men, some in boats, others wading through shallow water toward the shore. You are among them, your armor heavy, your musket loaded, your stomach tight with apprehension. The plan, as explained, is simple. Land on Mactan, march to Lapu-Lapu's settlement, demonstrate European superiority, and accept the chief's submission. Magellan has specifically requested that Raja Humayun's warriors remain in their boats, observing but not participating. He wants the victory to be clearly European, a demonstration of the power available to Christian converts. The landing goes poorly from the start. The beach isn't where the boats can reach. You wade through waist-deep water, holding your musket above your head, your armor dragging at you. The distance to shore stretches longer than anticipated, and on the beach you can see warriors gathering, not dozens, but hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, armed with bamboo spears, fire-hardened wooden weapons, shields, and a clear determination to defend their home. Magellan orders the musketeers to fire. The guns roar, smoke billowing. Several warriors fall. But the range is too great for accuracy, and the noise, which might intimidate people who've never heard firearms, doesn't scatter these fighters. They've had weeks to observe the Europeans, to understand that the guns are merely weapons, not supernatural thunder. They hold their ground. You reach the beach, exhausted from waiting, and immediately face attack from multiple directions. The warriors move with coordinated purpose, targeting the Europeans while staying mobile, refusing to present static targets. Your armor, so impressive in demonstrations, becomes a liability. It's heavy, it restricts movement, and it offers little protection against the bamboo spears that probe for gaps. The battle devolves into chaos. Magellan tries to maintain formation, but the Europeans are too few and too disorganized. Warriors press from all sides. You fire your musket, reload desperately, fire again. The process takes too long. Between shots, you defend yourself with your sword, parrying spears, trying to stay on your feet in the sand. Magellan himself becomes the focus of attack. Whether Lapu-Lapu's warriors recognize him as the leader, or he simply stands in the thick of fighting, they concentrate their assault on him. He's struck in the leg by a poisoned arrow. Then a spear hits his arm. He continues fighting, ordering his men to retreat slowly to maintain some semblance of order. But the warriors press harder, sensing victory. You're already backing toward the water, trying to reach the boats. You see Magellan surrounded, still standing, still fighting, but clearly overwhelmed. A warrior strikes him in the face with a spear. Another hits his leg. He falls. The warriors surge forward, and in the melee that follows, Ferdinand Magellan, who navigated across the world, who survived the Pacific, who led this extraordinary expedition, dies on a beach on Mactan Island, struck down by men defending their home from foreign intervention. The retreat becomes a rout. You flee into the water, abandoning any pretense of military discipline. The warriors pursue to the water's edge, but don't follow into the deeper water where the boats wait. You haul yourself aboard, gasping, checking your body for wounds. Around you, other survivors do the same. More than a dozen Europeans lie dead on the beach or wounded in the boats. Magellan's body remains on Mactan, and despite requests, Lapu-Lapu refuses to return it. The commander who led you across the world will not receive Christian burial. The fleet is suddenly leaderless. Magellan had ruled with unquestioned authority, his force of personality holding the expedition together through impossible hardships. Now that authority has vanished, and the remaining officers must somehow navigate not just the voyage home, but the immediate political situation in Cebu. João Serrao and Duarte Barbosa assume joint command of what remains of the expedition. The losses at Mactan, combined with scurvy and other deaths during the Pacific crossing, mean the fleet no longer has enough healthy sailors to properly crew 3 ships. Decisions must be made about consolidation, about routes, about whether to continue westward or attempt the Pacific crossing again in reverse. Raja Humabin's attitude shifts after Mactan. The demonstration of European vulnerability has altered the political calculus. The Raja remains outwardly friendly, but you sense a change in tone, a wariness that wasn't present before. When Humabin invites the expedition's officers to a feast to celebrate the return of health to a local noble who had converted to Christianity, the invitation seems genuine enough. The officers discuss potential risk, but decide that declining might cause greater offense. They need to maintain the Raja's goodwill to secure provisions for the voyage ahead. On May 1st, 1521, approximately 29 Europeans go ashore to attend the feast. You are not among them. Your duties keep you aboard ship that day, a piece of fortune whose significance you cannot yet know. The feast begins normally. Food is served. Toasts are made. Then suddenly, the atmosphere changes. A prearranged signal, perhaps, or simply a moment when the host's intentions become clear. The Cebuano warriors fall upon the Europeans with coordinated violence. From the ships, you hear the sounds, shouts, screams, the clash of weapons. You see figures running on shore. The remaining Europeans aboard the vessels scramble to respond, but the feast is taking place inland, too far for immediate intervention. Boats are lowered. Armed men prepare to launch a rescue. But by the time any organized response can be mounted, the massacre is complete. Only a handful of Europeans escape, swimming to the boats or fleeing through the settlement in chaos. The rest, including the 2 men who had assumed command after Magellan's death, are killed. The expedition has now lost its commander and both of his immediate successors within 5 days. The political relationship with Raja Humabin, so carefully cultivated, has collapsed utterly. The survivors aboard ship don't wait to learn more. The anchors are hauled up hastily. The sails are set. The 3 remaining ships flee Cebu, leaving behind the dead and any hope of understanding exactly what political calculation led to the massacre. Perhaps Humabon decided the weakened Europeans presented more risk than benefit. Perhaps the display at Mactan convinced him that Spanish power was overrated. Perhaps other factors you'll never understand played their role. It doesn't matter now. You sail away from Cebu with desperate haste, putting distance between yourselves and an island that has become unmistakably hostile. Juan Sebastian Elcano emerges from the chaos as the expedition's new leader, though his authority is more collaborative than Magellan's had been. The surviving officers hold councils, making decisions collectively, trying to determine the best path forward. The reality you face is stark. 3 ships with barely enough healthy sailors to crew 2, supplies running low, thousands of miles from Spain in either direction, and no clear consensus on whether to continue west or turn back. The decision is made to continue westward toward the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, which you know lie somewhere in this region. The voyage's original objective was to establish Spanish access to the spice trade, to break Portuguese control of these valuable goods. If you can reach the Moluccas, acquire a cargo of cloves or nutmeg, and return to Spain, the expedition might still be deemed successful despite its catastrophic losses. You island hop through the Philippines, stopping for water and supplies, but avoiding prolonged stays or political entanglements. The expedition has learned caution. One of the 3 ships, the Concepcion, is determined to be unseaworthy. Her timbers are too worm-eaten, her leaks too numerous. The decision is made to strip her of anything valuable and burn her. You spend days transferring supplies and equipment to the 2 remaining vessels, the Trinidad and Victoria. Then you watch the Concepcion burn, her flames reflecting off the water, another marker of how much has been lost. With 2 ships, you continue south and west. You navigate through Indonesian waters, asking at each stop for directions to the Moluccas. The information is sometimes helpful, sometimes contradictory, but gradually you piece together a route. The islands here are densely populated, connected by trade routes older than any European nation. You are entering a world where Portuguese traders have already established a presence, where your arrival is neither novel nor particularly welcome. In November 1521, more than 2 years after leaving Spain, you reach the Moluccas. Specifically, you arrive at Tidor, one of several small islands where clove trees grow. The Sultan of Tidor receives you with careful courtesy. He's aware of Portuguese activities in the region and sees potential advantage in offering the Spanish an alternative relationship. You're permitted to trade, to acquire cloves, those dried flower buds, worth more than their weight in silver in European markets. The loading of spices becomes the expedition's focus. You pack cloves carefully into the holds, understanding that this cargo represents the voyage's financial justification. If you can bring these spices to Spain, if you can break the Portuguese monopoly, even symbolically, the expedition might be remembered for something beyond its terrible death toll. But the Trinidad begins showing serious problems. Her hull is leaking badly. Repairs are attempted, but prove insufficient. The decision is made to leave the Trinidad at Tidor for proper repairs, while the Victoria sails for Spain immediately, hoping to catch favorable winds. The plan is for the Trinidad to follow once seaworthy. You watch as the expedition divides, some men staying with the Trinidad, others boarding the Victoria for the attempt at reaching home. You sail aboard the Victoria, now under Elcano's command. The ship carries 60 men and a hold full of clothes. The route ahead is known. At least in theory, you'll sail west across the Indian Ocean, round the southern tip of Africa, and head north to Spain. This is the route the Portuguese have been sailing for decades. You'll be traveling through waters they consider their territory, risking interception, but there's no alternative. The Pacific crossing proved too deadly to attempt in reverse. The voyage westward becomes another ordeal of endurance. You cross the Indian Ocean, carefully avoiding Portuguese outposts, not stopping for supplies for fear of capture. The food situation deteriorates again. Scurvy returns. Men begin dying once more. You watch the familiar pattern of swelling limbs, loosening teeth, old wounds reopening. Bodies are committed to the sea, with prayers that have become routine through repetition. You round the Cape of Good Hope in May 1522, fighting through storms that rival anything you experienced near the Strait of Magellan. The Victoria is showing her age, leaking constantly, requiring round-the-clock pumping. Your crew is down to barely enough men to sail the ship. Each death makes the situation more precarious. Desperately short on food, you're forced to stop at the Cape Verde Islands Portuguese territory in July 1522. It's an enormous risk, but starvation allows no alternative. You anchor offshore and send a boat to request provisions, claiming you've been blown off course from the Americas. The Portuguese are suspicious, but provide some supplies. You're loading water casks when Portuguese officials become too curious, asking too many questions. The boat ashore is captured with 13 men aboard. The Victoria flees immediately, abandoning those men to Portuguese captivity, sacrificing them to save the ship and its cargo. On September 6, 1522, the Victoria limps into San Lucar de Barrameda at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. 2 days later, she anchors at Seville. 18 European men have survived less than 7% of those who departed. The ship is barely floating, held together by prayers and endless pumping. The crew are skeletal, scurvy-damaged, hardly able to walk. But in the hold, carefully preserved, are 26 tons of clothes, worth approximately 10,000 ducats, more than enough to cover the entire expedition's cost. You stagger off the ship, your legs uncertain on solid ground after so long in sea. The world has continued without you. Friends have aged, families have moved or died. The political situation has shifted. You've been presumed dead for more than a year, and now you've returned as one of the first men to circumnavigate the globe, to sail completely around the world and return to your starting point. The achievement is difficult to process. Your mind still holds the countless horrors, the starvation, the scurvy, the storms, the deaths, the desperate consumption of rats and leather. You remember Magellan's death on Mactan, the massacre at Cebu, the burning of the Concepcion, the men left behind at Tidor and the Cape Verde Islands. You remember more than 250 shipmates who will never see home again. But you've also witnessed wonders beyond imagination. You've seen the southern constellations, entirely different from the northern stars you grew up navigating by. You've crossed the Pacific, that vast ocean whose size makes the Atlantic seem a mere pond. You've visited lands no European had seen before, met people who had never heard of Spain or Christianity, or the conflicts that define European politics. You've proven that the world is indeed a sphere, that by sailing always westward, you can return to your starting point, that the old maps were more wrong than anyone suspected. The expedition's survivors are granted audiences with the king. You tell your stories, though the telling feels inadequate. How do you convey the reality of 98 days without landfall to people who've never been more than a day's ride from shelter? How do you explain what it means to eat leather, to watch your teeth loosen from scurvy, to see men die daily from causes no physician can address? Elcano is celebrated as the circumnavigation's hero, granted a coat of arms featuring a globe and the motto Primus circumdisi me, you first encircled me. The other survivors receive pensions, small sums that acknowledge their suffering without quite compensating for it. You take your pension and try to resume life in a world that feels simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The Trinidad, you eventually learn, never made it home. She attempted to cross the Pacific eastward, fighting contrary winds for months before giving up and returning to the Moluccas, where Portuguese forces captured the survivors. Some eventually returned to Spain through Portuguese captivity. Others died in Asian prisons. The men abandoned at the Cape Verde Islands are eventually released and make their way home. But the expedition's final accounting remains devastating 5 ships and 270 men reduced to 1 ship and 18 survivors. And yet, the voyage has changed everything. The circumnavigation proved the world's size and shape. It demonstrated that the Pacific could be crossed, opening possibilities for future trade routes. The cargo of cloves, despite all the death required to transport it, showed that such voyages could be profitable. Within decades, Spain will establish the Manila galleon route, sending ships annually from Mexico to the Philippines and back, creating the first truly global trade network. But right now, sitting in a tavern in Seville, drinking wine from a cup that doesn't need to be carefully rationed, eating bread that contains no weevils, you think mostly about sleep. Real sleep, in a bed that doesn't move, in a room that doesn't reek of bilge water, with the certain knowledge that tomorrow you won't wake to another day of desperate sailing across endless water. The voyage has ended. You survived. That achievement, both monumental and terrible, will define the rest of your life. Now let us step back from the immediate suffering of the voyage and consider a quieter mystery. The question that must have haunted every sailor who watched the coastline disappear behind him. How do you know where you are when nothing around you offers reference? How do you find your way across an ocean that shows no paths, leaves no trails, offers no landmarks beyond the movement of celestial bodies overhead? The art of navigation in Magellan's era represents a fascinating blend of ancient knowledge, medieval refinement, and Renaissance innovation, all underlaid by a fundamental limitation that wouldn't be solved for another 2.5 centuries. Understanding how these explorers found their way, or more accurately, how they estimated their position with varying degrees of accuracy, reveals both remarkable ingenuity and breathtaking audacity. Begin with the most fundamental question a navigator must answer. How far north or south am I? This is the problem of latitude, and by the early 16th century, solutions existed that worked reasonably well, at least when conditions permitted their use. The primary instrument for measuring latitude is the astrolabe, a device whose ancestry reaches back to ancient Greece, refined by Islamic scholars during the medieval period, and adapted for maritime use by Portuguese navigators in the 15th century. Imagine holding one in your hands. It's a circular brass disc, perhaps 6 to 8 inches in diameter, heavy enough to hang steadily, but not so heavy as to be unwieldy. Around its edge, degrees are carefully engraved, 360 divisions marking the full circle. The mariner's astrolabe is simpler than its terrestrial cousin, stripped of the elaborate sighting mechanisms and calculation aids that astronomers use. It has a rotating bar called an alidade, fitted with pinhole sights at each end. You suspend the astrolabe from its ring, allowing gravity to hold it vertical. Then you rotate the alidade until you can sight the sun or a star through both pinholes, with the celestial body aligned precisely. The alidade points to a degree, marking on the astrolabe's edge, giving you the altitude, the angle between the horizon and the celestial body. In practice, using an astrolabe at sea presents considerable challenges. You must take your reading at a specific time, local noon, for sun sightings, when the sun reaches its highest point. You must stand on a rolling deck, trying to keep the instrument steady while the ship pitches and yaws. You must avoid looking directly at the sun while somehow confirming it's centered in your sights. The procedure requires practice, patience, and multiple readings to average out errors. An alternative instrument, somewhat easier to use aboard ship, is the cross staff, also called the Jacob staff. This device consists of a long wooden staff, perhaps 3 feet in length, with a perpendicular crosspiece that slides along its length. You hold one end of the staff to your eye, slide the crosspiece until its upper edge aligns with the sun or star, and its lower edge aligns with the horizon. Then read the measurement from markings on the staff. The cross staff is lighter than an astrolabe, less prone to damage, and somewhat easier to use on a moving deck, though it still requires you to observe the sun while simultaneously watching the horizon a feat that becomes uncomfortable quickly and can damage your vision over time. Once you've measured the sun's altitude at noon, You must consult tables carefully copied books listing the sun's declination for every day of the year. The sun's position relative to the celestial equator changes throughout the year, moving north in summer, south in winter, tracing an annual pattern. By knowing today's date and the sun's measured altitude, you can calculate your latitude with reasonable accuracy, perhaps within a degree, sometimes better. At night, Northern Hemisphere navigators can use Polaris, the North Star, which sits almost directly above the North Pole. Polaris's altitude above the horizon equals your latitude, a beautifully simple relationship. But Polaris is only visible in the Northern Hemisphere, and even there, only clearly visible when skies are clear and the moon isn't too bright. Southern Hemisphere navigators must rely on more complex calculations using the Southern Cross and other constellations, patterns that European sailors are only beginning to learn during Magellan's era. All of this works for determining latitude, your north-south position. But the other half of the navigation problem, the question of longitude, your east-west position, remains fundamentally unsolvable with early 16th century technology. Longitude requires knowing time with precision. The Earth rotates through 360 degrees in 24 hours, meaning 15 degrees of longitude per hour, or 1 degree every 4 minutes. If you could know the exact time in two places simultaneously, say, your current location and a reference point like Seville, you could calculate your longitude by comparing local noon at each location. But maintaining accurate time at sea proves impossible with the technology available to Magellan. Mechanical clocks exist in Magellan's time, but they're large, temperamental devices that require regular adjustment. The pendulum clock, which offers greater accuracy, won't be invented until the 17th century. And even the finest mechanical clocks of the era cannot maintain accuracy aboard ship, where temperature variations, humidity, and constant motion disrupt their mechanisms. A clock that loses or gains even a few seconds per day will be off by minutes after weeks at sea, and those minutes translate to degrees of longitude, potentially hundreds of miles of error. Various proposals exist for solving the longitude problem. Some suggest using lunar eclipses, which occur at the same absolute time worldwide observers in different locations could record the local time when an eclipse occurs, then compare notes to calculate longitude differences. But eclipses are rare and often obscured by clouds when they do occur. Others propose using the moon's position against the background stars as a kind of celestial clock, but the calculations required are enormously complex and the moon's motion isn't perfectly regular. The longitude problem won't be practically solved until John Harrison develops his marine chronometer in the 18th century, mechanical clock so precisely built and so carefully insulated from temperature and motion effects that it can maintain accuracy for months at sea. This development lies more than 200 years in Magellan's future. Until then, navigators simply cannot determine their east-west position with any accuracy. This creates a fascinating and terrifying situation. A navigator can know quite precisely how far north or south he's traveled, but east-west position must be estimated through dead reckoning, a combination of measured distance, compass heading, current estimates, and accumulated guesswork that grows less accurate with every passing day at sea. Dead reckoning begins with direction. The magnetic compass has been available to European sailors since at least the 13th century. The principle is simple. A magnetized needle, balanced so it can rotate freely, aligns itself with Earth's magnetic field, pointing north. Mount this needle on a card marked with directions. Float the assembly in oil or suspend it in gimbals to keep it level despite the ship's motion, and you have a reasonably reliable direction indicator. But the magnetic compass comes with complications. The needle points to magnetic north, not true north, and the difference between them, the magnetic variation or declination changes depending on where you are. In some locations, magnetic north lies east of true north. In others, it lies west. The variation can be quite substantial, 10 or 15 degrees or more, and it changes gradually as you sail to different regions. Some navigators maintain tables of magnetic variation for different areas, but much of the world remains unmapped, and the variation itself shifts slowly over years and decades. Additionally, iron aboard ship can deflect the compass. Cannon, anchors, chains, even nails in the ship's structure can pull the needle off true. Careful navigators place the compass away from large iron objects, but some deviation is unavoidable. You learn your ship's particular quirks, the slight errors that appear on different headings, and you compensate instinctively. With direction established by compass, you need distance. How far has the ship traveled? The most basic method is visual estimation. An experienced sailor can judge the ship's speed by watching the water slide past, noting the wake's pattern, feeling the wind's pressure. Speed is traditionally measured in knots, a term that comes from the chip log, a device that won't be standardized until after Magellan's era, but whose principles are already in use. A chip log consists of a wooden board attached to a long line with knots tied at regular intervals. You throw the board overboard, letting the line run out freely as the ship sails away from it. By counting how many knots pass through your hands in a specific time period, measured with a sandglass, you can calculate speed. The term knot as a unit of speed comes directly from this practice, though the exact standardization of intervals and timing develops gradually. Without a chip log, you estimate speed by eye and experience. You note when the ship feels fast or sluggish. You watch the angle of the wake. You sense the pressure against the hull. Over time, experienced sailors develop remarkably accurate intuitions, but these remain approximations, subject to error. Every few hours, perhaps every watch change, you record your estimated position. You start from your last known location, perhaps a harbor you departed or a headland you passed. You note the compass heading you've maintained, the estimated speed, the duration. You calculate, if we've been sailing northwest at 4 knots for 6 hours, we've traveled 24 nautical miles in a northwest direction. You mark this on your chart, updating your position. But errors accumulate. If your speed estimate is slightly off, you're not where you think you are. If currents are pushing you sideways, and ocean currents are poorly understood in Magellan's era, you're drifting from your calculated position. If the compass variation is different from what you expect, you're gradually turning away from your intended course. After days at sea, your dead reckoning position might be off by tens of miles. After weeks, possibly hundreds. After months crossing the Pacific, Magellan's navigators have only the vaguest idea of their longitude. This uncertainty explains why Pacific islands prove so difficult to find. You might know quite accurately how far south you are, but without longitude, you don't know when to expect land. You sail day after day, hoping to spot an island, knowing that if you pass too far north or south of it, you'll miss it entirely. The Pacific's vastness makes this problem almost paralyzing. You can sail for weeks without seeing land, never knowing if you've already passed your destination or if it still lies ahead. To supplement dead reckoning and celestial navigation, sailors rely on rudders' written sailing directions compiled by previous voyages. A rudder might read, "From Cape Finisterre, sail southwest for 2 days at good speed, watching for changes in water color. When the water turns green, you approach soundings. Cast your lead line until you reach bottom at approximately 50 fathoms. The bottom will be sand mixed with small shells. Turn south and sail along the coast, keeping to 50 fathoms depth until you sight a headland with 3 distinct peaks." Rudders combine practical observation with experiential knowledge. They note landmarks, water depths, current patterns, wind behaviors, hazards to avoid. They describe bottom composition, sand, mud, shells, rock, as determined by the sounding lead, a weight attached to a line marked with fathoms. The lead's bottom is coated with tallow, which picks up samples of the seafloor, helping identify location by comparing against known descriptions. Portuguese navigators had developed extensive rudders for the route to India around Africa. compiled over decades of voyages. These documents are considered state secrets, valuable strategic assets. Similarly, Spanish navigators compile rudders for the Atlantic crossing to the Americas. But Magellan's voyage enters regions where no European rudders exist. The Strait of Magellan, the Pacific Ocean, the Philippines. For these waters, Magellan's expedition must create the first European rudders, describing conditions for future navigators. The maps available to Magellan reflect this limited knowledge. European cartography in the early 16th century is transitioning from medieval tradition to something more empirical, but huge uncertainties remain. World maps from this era show the Mediterranean Sea and European coastlines with reasonable accuracy, derived from centuries of careful sailing. The African coast appears increasingly detailed, thanks to Portuguese exploration. The Caribbean and parts of the American coast are beginning to be mapped. But vast regions remain speculative. The Pacific Ocean is essentially unknown: its size, its island distributions, even its existence as a separate body of water connecting to the Indian Ocean. Some maps show it as a narrow channel. Others leave it blank or fill the space with decorative elements: sea monsters, compass roses, cartouches, elaborate text. The famous phrase, "Here be dragons," is largely mythical. Actual maps more commonly write, "Here be lions," or simply leave regions empty, but the sentiment is accurate. Unknown regions are acknowledged as unknown, decorated with imagination rather than information. Latitude lines appear on better maps, allowing you to track north-south position. But longitude lines, when present, are largely decorative. Without a way to accurately measure longitude, these lines can't be properly verified. The width of continents, the distance between landmarks, the size of oceans, all remain uncertain. Some maps include rhumb lines, radiating lines showing compass bearings from various points. These aids to navigation assume you're sailing relatively short distances where the Earth's curvature doesn't significantly affect compass headings. For ocean crossings, more sophisticated understanding is required, but the mathematics of great circle routes, the shortest path between 2 points on a sphere, remains poorly integrated into practical navigation. Magellan's expedition carries whatever maps and charts are available, supplemented by information gathered from Portuguese sources, some legitimately obtained, some acquired through less official channels. Magellan himself had served Portugal before transferring allegiance to Spain, and he brings knowledge of Portuguese discoveries, though how much detail he actually possesses remains debated. The navigation of unknown waters combines calculation with intuition. You maintain your dead reckoning as carefully as possible. You take celestial observations whenever conditions permit: clear skies, calm seas, suitable timing. You watch constantly for land signs, birds that indicate proximity to shore, changes in water color suggesting shallower depths, floating vegetation, cloud formations that might indicate land beneath them. You sound regularly when you suspect you're approaching a coast, dropping the lead line to check for bottom, noting depth changes that might warn of hazards. And you accept uncertainty as fundamental to the enterprise. When Magellan enters the Pacific and sails northwest, he doesn't know what he'll find or when. He follows prevailing winds and currents, maintains the heading that seems most promising, and hopes for land before supplies run out. When he estimates the Pacific's width at a few weeks sailing, a catastrophic underestimate, he's not being foolish. He's working with the limited information available, making educated guesses and hoping circumstances prove favorable. The Pacific crossing becomes a navigation nightmare, precisely because of longitude's unsolvability. Magellan can track his latitude daily, confirming he's maintaining his intended course north of south. But he cannot know how far west he's traveled. The 98 days without landfall exceed all experience. The Atlantic crossing takes 4 to 6 weeks. The Indian Ocean from Africa to India, perhaps similar. A crossing of 3 months defies expectation. But without longitude, you cannot know when to expect arrival. You simply sail, day after day, trusting your direction and hoping your supplies last. When land finally appears, the Marianas, the exact longitude remains uncertain. You know you've reached islands in the western Pacific, but mapping them accurately requires longitude measurements you cannot make. Future voyages will gradually refine these positions through accumulated observations and improved techniques, but Magellan's charts remain approximations. The return voyage under Elcano benefits from sailing mostly through Portuguese mapped waters. The Indian Ocean route around Africa has been charted, described in rudders, verified by repeated voyages. But even here, without longitude, positions remain approximate. The Victoria's navigation across the Indian Ocean relies on latitude sailing, reaching the correct latitude for your destination, then sailing along that latitude until you encounter land. This technique works, but is inefficient, requiring potentially long detours to reach the correct latitude before proceeding east or west. Consider what this uncertainty means psychologically. You sail for months knowing only approximately where you are. You trust your navigator's calculations, but you understand those calculations accumulate errors. You might be 50 miles off course, or 200 or more. When you expect to sight land and don't, you face agonizing questions. Did we miss it? Are we past it? Should we turn back or press forward? These decisions, made with incomplete information, determine survival or death. The instruments themselves become almost talismanic. The astrolabe, the compass, the lead line these devices connect you to the cosmos, to the Earth's magnetic field, to the solid ground beneath the ocean. Using them properly, interpreting their readings correctly, represents not just technical skill, but a kind of communion with the universe's ordered structure. When clouds obscure the sun for days, when storms make celestial observations impossible, you feel genuinely lost, cut off from the navigational certainties that define your position in space. At night, clear weather allows a different kind of orientation. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. In the northern hemisphere, the familiar constellations Ursa Major, pointing to Polaris, Orion striding across the ecliptic, the zodiacal constellations marking the sun's annual path provide comfort through recognition. But as you sail south, these patterns shift. Polaris drops toward the horizon, eventually disappearing entirely. New constellations appear. The Southern Cross, invisible from Europe, becomes the Southern Navigator's pole star substitute. The mathematics of navigation, while simpler than later developments, still require education. Not every sailor can take celestial observations or calculate latitude. These skills concentrate in the navigator and his assistants, men who've studied geometry and astronomy, who understand spherical trigonometry well enough to perform the necessary calculations. The knowledge passes through apprenticeship from experienced navigators to students who memorize procedures, practice calculations, gradually internalize the mental models that transform observations into positions. Books help codify this knowledge. Printed navigation manuals begin appearing in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, though they remain expensive and relatively rare. These texts explain instrument use, provide astronomical tables, describe calculation procedures. But much knowledge remains oral, experiential, accumulated through years of watching experienced navigators work, learning the subtle judgments that distinguish competent from exceptional navigation. The remarkable achievement is not that Renaissance navigation had limitations. That's inevitable given available technology. The remarkable achievement is that it worked well enough to enable transoceanic exploration. Without accurate longitude, without reliable charts, with instruments that required calm seas and clear skies, navigators still managed to find their way across oceans, return to tiny islands, chart coastlines with increasing accuracy. Magellan's circumnavigation, despite its terrible human cost, contributed immensely to navigation knowledge. The expedition proved the Pacific's enormous size, forcing cartographers to radically revise their estimates. It provided the first European descriptions of Pacific currents and winds. It demonstrated that systematic westward sailing could reach the East Indies, establishing the principle that would lead to regular trans-Pacific trade routes. But in the immediate moment, aboard ship, the navigation techniques remain as they've been: a blend of careful observation, mathematical calculation, accumulated experience, and simple hope. You watch the sun's arc. You note the compass heading. You estimate your speed and mark your position. And you trust that the accumulated small accuracies will outweigh the accumulated small errors. That when land is supposed to appear, it will indeed be there. That the ocean will not prove infinite. That your calculations connect meaningfully to reality. In this uncertainty lies both terror and wonder. Terror because you're traveling beyond the known world, into spaces that no map accurately depicts, trusting your life to instruments and calculations that you know are imperfect. Wonder because despite all this, it works. The sun rises where the tables predict. The stars move as the models describe. The earth reveals itself as fundamentally knowable, even when specific knowledge remains elusive. And so you sail onward, taking your observations, updating your position, maintaining course toward a destination that exists more as calculation than certainty, trusting that mathematics and accumulated wisdom will guide you through. The Victorias returned to Spain in 1522, battered and barely afloat, but carrying a hold full of valuable clothes, proved something that would reshape the world economy. The Pacific could be crossed, and crossing it could be profitable. But the real transformation wouldn't come from westward voyages to the Spice Islands. Portuguese power there remained too entrenched, and the route too deadly. Instead, within a few decades, Spain would establish something more enduring: a trans-Pacific trade route connecting silver mines in the Americas with the luxury goods of Asia, creating the first truly global economy and generating wealth on a scale that dwarfed even the spice trade. Let us trace this system from its origins in the earth, in the mountains of what is now Bolivia, where silver lay buried in quantities beyond European imagination. The mountain called Potosi rises above the Bolivian Altiplano like a perfect cone, its symmetry so striking that indigenous peoples considered it sacred long before Spanish arrival. And within this mountain, seams of silver ore run through the rock in concentrations that, when discovered in 1545, seemed inexhaustible. Within a few years of discovery, Potosi transforms from a scattered indigenous settlement into one of the largest cities in the world, its population eventually reaching perhaps 200,000 people larger than London or Seville at the time, all drawn by silver. The extraction of this silver requires enormous labor. The Spanish implement a system called the MIDA, adapted from Incan practices of mandatory public service, but expanded and made far more brutal. Indigenous communities throughout the region must send a portion of their men, roughly 1/7, to work in the mines for periods of 4 months at a time. The selection rotates, theoretically distributing the burden, but in practice, it becomes a death sentence applied methodically across entire populations. Imagine yourself subject to the MIDA, living in a village in the Altiplano. The Spanish officials arrive, consult their lists, and announce which men must report. You gather minimal possessions, blankets, coca leaves to chew for energy and hunger suppression, perhaps some dried potatoes. You leave behind your family, your fields, your life, and join the long columns of men walking toward Potosi. The journey itself takes days or weeks, depending on distance. You walk through thin air at altitudes where breathing requires effort, where the cold penetrates to your bones at night. Arriving at Potosi, you enter a city unlike anything in your experience. Wooden structures climb the mountain's flanks. The streets teem with people, indigenous laborers like yourself, Spanish overseers, merchants, enslaved Africans, mixed-race intermediaries, all swirling in an economy built on silver. The mountain itself is pierced with mine shafts, dark openings that descend into the earth, from which emerge men carrying ore, their bodies bent under the weight. Your work begins. You descend into the mines, sometimes hundreds of feet down, following tunnels that branch and twist through the rock. The passages are narrow, requiring you to crouch or crawl. The air is thin even on the surface. Down here, it becomes suffocating. Candles provide minimal light, their flames flickering in the insufficient oxygen. The temperature alternates between extremes cold in some sections, oppressively hot in others, where the Earth's heat radiates through the rock. You work with simple tools, hammers, chisels, picks breaking ore loose from the rock face. When you've filled your basket or sack with ore, you carry it toward the surface. Some mines have primitive ladders, others only notched logs or rope. You climb in darkness, the ore's weight pressing down, your legs burning from effort, your lungs gasping for air that doesn't satisfy. You empty your load and descend again. This cycle repeats through your shift, which might last 12 hours or more. The dangers are omnipresent and varied. Tunnels collapse, burying men alive. Rotten supports give way. Rocks fall from above. Men lose their footing on slippery ladders and plummet into darkness. The dust you breathe fine particles of stone, and ore accumulates in your lungs, causing persistent coughing that worsens over time. Others sicken from the mine's toxic air, or from exhaustion, or from injuries that become infected in the dirty conditions. The Mida officially lasts 4 months, but many men don't survive to complete their service. Others emerge so weakened that they die shortly after, their bodies unable to recover from the sustained deprivation. The demographic impact on indigenous communities is catastrophic. Villages lose their working-age men steadily, year after year. Population declines. Agricultural production falters without sufficient labor. The social fabric tears under sustained pressure. But the silver flows. Ore emerges from the mines, is crushed and processed, and eventually becomes refined silver in various forms: ores, coins, worked objects. The volume is staggering. During the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Potosi produces roughly 60% of the world's silver. Other mines in Mexico and Peru add to the total. This American silver floods into the Spanish economy, flows through Europe, and ultimately much of it continues eastward to Asia. The Spanish colonial system channels this silver through a carefully controlled network. Silver from Potosi and other Andean mines travels to Lima on Peru's coast. From Lima, ships carry it north to Panama, where it's transported overland across the isthmus a journey of days through tropical jungle on muleback. On Panama's Caribbean side, the silver is loaded onto ships that join treasure fleets sailing to Spain, convoyed by warships to protect against pirates and rival nations. But another route emerges, equally important and eventually more valuable. Silver from Mexican mines Zacatecas, Guanajuato, and others travels overland to Acapulco on the Pacific coast. And from Acapulco, beginning in 1565, ships begin sailing to the Philippines, to Manila, carrying silver to exchange for Asian goods. This is the Manila galleon trade, and it becomes one of the most profitable commercial routes in history. The Manila galleon voyage represents its own form of ordeal, though different from Magellan's pioneering circumnavigation. The route becomes standardized through hard-won experience. Westbound galleons depart Acapulco in March or April, catching favorable winds that carry them across the Pacific in 8 to 12 weeks, much faster than Magellan's crossing, thanks to better knowledge of winds and currents. The ships are large, often 300 to 500 tons, heavily built to withstand Pacific storms, their holds packed with silver. Aboard these galleons, the crew faces familiar maritime hardships: cramped quarters, limited food, a constant threat of scurvy. But the crossing, while difficult, is relatively predictable. The route is known. The duration is expected. Supply planning improves over decades. It remains dangerous storms sink ships, disease kills crew, privateers and pirates present constant threats. But it's no longer the leap into the unknown that Magellan faced. Arriving in Manila, the galleon enters a complex commercial world. The Philippines have become Spain's foothold in Asia, a colonial outpost governed from distant Madrid, but economically oriented toward China and the broader Asian trade network. Manila itself is a diverse city, Spanish colonial administrators and clergy, indigenous Filipinos, Chinese merchants who form a substantial community, Japanese traders, and people from throughout the maritime Asian world. The Chinese merchants are central to the galleon trade. China produces the goods Europe craves: silk in enormous quantities and varieties. Porcelain of a quality European kilns cannot match. Lacquerware, spices, precious stones, exotic woods, fine furniture, intricate crafts. Chinese junks sail to Manila regularly, carrying these goods to exchange for Spanish silver. The exchange rate favors silver highly in China, where the metal is valued more than in Europe relative to gold. This price differential drives the entire trade. The transactions are substantial. A single galleon might carry 2 million pesos in silver, an almost incomprehensible sum. This silver purchases silk by the ton, porcelain by the thousands of pieces, and countless other luxury goods. Chinese merchants in Manila act as intermediaries, negotiating prices, arranging deliveries, managing the complex logistics of assembling cargoes. Some accumulate enormous wealth, building substantial homes in Manila's Parian, the Chinese Quarter. The relationship between Spanish authorities and the Chinese community is complicated and often tense. The Spanish depend on Chinese commercial networks, but fear the growing Chinese population in Manila. Periodic massacres punctuate the relationship episodes where Spanish authorities, fearing Chinese rebellion, or simply driven by xenophobic paranoia, order the killing of Chinese residents. Thousands die in these outbursts. Then, when commercial activity stalls without Chinese merchants, the Spanish encourage new immigration, rebuilding the community until the next cycle of violence. It's a pattern of dependence and brutality that repeats through centuries. Once the westbound galleon has discharged its silver and loaded Asian goods, it faces the return journey, a voyage far more challenging than the westward crossing. The eastbound route requires sailing north from the Philippines, sometimes as far as Japan's latitude, to catch the Kuroshio Current and westerly winds that can carry ships back toward North America. This northern route passes through cold waters where fog and storms are common. The voyage typically takes 5 to 7 months, sometimes longer. The extended duration makes the eastbound journey particularly deadly. Scurvy becomes almost inevitable on voyages lasting 6 months or more. Food supplies run low. Water turns brackish. The crew suffers through weeks of tedium punctuated by storms. Many ships arrive in Acapulco with half their crew dead or dying, the survivors barely able to work the vessel into port. But the cargo makes it worthwhile. The Asian goods loaded in Manila sell in Mexico and Spain for enormous profits. Silk, especially, commands extraordinary prices. Spanish and Mexican elites crave Chinese silk, its quality, its colors, its drape superior to European textiles. Wealthy households furnish themselves with Asian luxury goods, porcelain for dining, lacquered furniture, folding screens, decorative objects. Churches commission silk vestments, elaborate embroidered pieces that demonstrate both wealth and piety. The Manila galleon trade becomes so profitable that it's tightly controlled. Officially, only 2 ships are permitted annually, one sailing westbound from Acapulco, one returning. The cargo space is allocated proportionally among investors, with shares distributed to colonial officials, merchants, religious institutions, and others with proper connections. A share in a galleon's cargo can represent years of income. Fortunes are made and lost when ships sink through this trade. This system creates a truly global economy for the first time in human history. Silver mined in Bolivia or Mexico, through the labor of indigenous Americans, travels across the Pacific to the Philippines, then to China, where it enters the Chinese economy. In return, Chinese goods flow back across the Pacific, through Mexico, sometimes continuing to Spain, and from Spain dispersing throughout Europe. Asian goods that arrive in Manila might ultimately reach London, Paris, or Vienna. European goods, wine, olive oil, books, religious objects flow westward across the Atlantic, through Mexico, across the Pacific to Manila. This network connects economic systems that had previously existed largely in isolation. Chinese demand for silver affects mining practices in Peru. European fashion preferences for silk influence Chinese textile production. Price changes in one region ripple through the system, transmitted along sea routes at the pace of sailing ships, slowly but inevitably. The wealth flowing through this system is extraordinary, but its distribution is profoundly unequal. Spanish elites in Madrid, Mexican colonial officials, successful Manila merchants. These groups accumulate enormous fortunes. They build palatial homes, commission elaborate churches, purchase vast estates, live in a luxury unprecedented in European history. Yet paradoxically, Spain itself doesn't become sustainably wealthier. The silver flowing from American mines passes through Spanish hands, but doesn't remain in Spain. Spain fights expensive wars in Europe and the Netherlands against France, maintaining its empire. These conflicts consume resources constantly. Spain also imports more than it exports. Spanish manufacturing cannot compete with producers in other European regions. So Spanish silver buys Flemish cloth, Italian goods, French wine. The silver flows out almost as quickly as it arrives. Meanwhile, inflation erodes silver's value. As American silver floods into Europe, prices rise. What once seemed like limitless wealth becomes worth less as supply overwhelms demand. By the early 17th century, Spain is borrowing heavily against future silver shipments, trapped in debt despite nominal control of history's richest mines. The human cost underlying this wealth remains constant. In the mines of Potosi, men continue to die extracting silver. In the Philippines, indigenous communities provide labor for Spanish estates, missions, and colonial infrastructure. On the galleons, sailors endure voyages that kill substantial portions of each crew. The Chinese merchants in Manila exist always under the threat of violence. Enslaved Africans, brought to the Americas, and sometimes continuing to the Philippines, labor in conditions that offer no hope of freedom. The indigenous populations of the Americas suffer demographic catastrophe. Diseases introduced by Europeans, smallpox, measles, typhus kill on a scale difficult to comprehend. Populations decline by 80%, 90%, sometimes more. Entire communities vanish. The survivors face forced labor systems, cultural suppression, and the systematic dismantling of their social structures. The wealth extracted from American mines represents not just geological fortune, but the conversion of human suffering into silver. Yet the system persists for centuries. The Manila galleons sail annually from 1565 until 1815 to 250 years of continuous operation, one of history's longest-lived trade routes. The silver flows. The goods exchange hands. Fortunes rise and fall. Empires expand and contract. And the fundamental pattern endures. Resources extracted through coerced labor, transported across vast distances at human cost, converted into luxury for a small elite. In Spain, you might live your entire life surrounded by the products of this system without seeing its foundations. You might dress in silk from China, ignorant of the galleon voyage that brought it. You might handle silver coins unaware of the mines where they originated. The system's violence and exploitation remain distant, abstracted by geography and social structure. The beautiful object on your table carries no visible trace of the suffering embedded in its creation. The churches of Spain, Mexico, and the Philippines gleam with colonial wealth. Silver altarpieces rise stories high, catching candlelight, demonstrating both religious devotion and imperial success. Chinese silk embroidered with Christian imagery drapes altars. The mingling of Asian luxury and European faith creates aesthetic splendor that inspires awe. These spaces proclaim God's glory and Spain's power simultaneously, suggesting divine approval for the colonial project. But step back from the individual experience, from the merchant tallying profits or the elite arranging silk hangings, and consider the system's totality. Observe the ships crossing the Pacific annually, their routes worn into the ocean by repetition. Trace the silver's flow from mountain to mine, to port to ship to Manila to China, and the reverse flow of goods. Count the deaths in the mines, aboard ships, in massacres, from disease, from systems that treat human lives as expendable resources. The numbers become incomprehensible, but they represent individual endings, multiplied thousands and thousands of times. The Manila galleon trade ultimately ends not through moral reformation, but through obsolescence. By the early 19th century, other routes and other arrangements prove more efficient. Mexico achieves independence from Spain in 1821, disrupting the colonial administrative structure. The Philippines remains Spanish until 1898, but the galleon trade has already ceased. The silver mines continue operating, now under different ownership, their extracted wealth flowing through different channels. But the consequences persist. The global economy created by Spanish colonial trade doesn't disappear. It evolves. The patterns of extraction and inequality, of periphery providing resources for core consumption, continue in modified forms. The demographic and cultural transformations in the Americas prove permanent. The Chinese diaspora communities throughout Southeast Asia trace partly from these colonial-era trade networks. The silver that flowed from American mines still circulates, melted and reformed countless times, but materially unchanged. And if you hold a piece of old silver, a coin from colonial Mexico, perhaps, or a worked piece from centuries past, you hold something that connected continents, that motivated voyages of incredible hardship, that represented wealth extracted through systems of profound injustice. The metal is beautiful, heavy in your palm, gleaming softly. Its beauty reveals nothing of its origins, but the origins remain, encoded not in the silver itself, but in the historical record, in the mines that still scar mountains, in the descendants of those who suffered, in the ongoing reality that our comfortable present rests on foundations built long ago through means we prefer not to examine too closely. The Manila galleons have ceased sailing. The routes lie empty of their regular traffic, but the world they helped create interconnected, commercially driven, profoundly unequal continues around you, evolved but recognizable, transformed but not transcended. And so we conclude our journey through this system, returning from the global network to the individual experience, from the centuries-long pattern to the present moment, where you rest comfortably, far removed from mines and galleons and the Pacific's vast expanse, holding knowledge of what came before, understanding how the present emerged from that difficult past. We have traveled far together tonight across oceans that tested human endurance, through political intrigues on distant islands, into the complexities of Renaissance navigation, and finally through the vast economic system that emerged from these voyages of suffering and discovery. You've experienced, at least through imagination, what it meant to sail with Magellan, the hunger that made leather seem edible, the scurvy that loosened teeth and reopened old wounds, the endless Pacific days where water and sky merged into monotonous infinity. You've witnessed Magellan's death on a beach at Mactan, struck down by warriors defending their home. You've understood the mathematical limitation that made longitude impossible to calculate, leaving navigators guessing at their east-west position across thousands of miles of ocean. And you've traced the flow of silver from Andean mines to Chinese markets, the human cost embedded in every coin, every silk garment, every porcelain cup. These histories interweave personal suffering and global transformation, individual courage and systemic exploitation, remarkable human achievement and terrible human cost. The first circumnavigation proved the world's true scope and opened routes that would reshape economies. But it did so through deaths counted in the hundreds, through suffering that nearly broke those who survived, through violence that echoed for centuries. Tonight, as you settle into rest, consider the distance between that world and yours. You lie comfortable, secure in shelter that doesn't pitch with waves. Your next meal waits reliably, free of weevils and rot. The scurvy that plagued sailors for centuries can't touch you, prevented by nutrition, so routine you don't consider it. The Pacific remains vast, but aircraft cross it in hours, robbing it of the terror that came from not knowing when or if you'd reach the other side. The world those sailors died mapping has been thoroughly charted. The silver they sought flows through different channels now. The systems they helped establish have transformed beyond recognition, though traces remain, persistent patterns that echo through centuries. But their experience, the fundamental reality of human endurance, tested against overwhelming hardship that remains comprehensible. We can still understand what it means to suffer, to fear, to push beyond what seems survivable, to witness wonders that make the suffering seem almost worthwhile, almost justified, though perhaps it never quite balances. Let these stories settle gently in your mind as sleep approaches. Let the rhythm of waves against wooden hulls, the creak of rigging, the endless patience required for long voyages, let these images ease you toward rest. The struggles are long past. The suffering has ended. The sailors have returned to port, or found rest beneath the waves, or crumbled to dust in foreign soil. And you, inheritor of the world they helped create, can release these histories, can let them drift away on the tide of approaching sleep, can rest in the comfort their suffering helped make possible, troubling as that inheritance might be. The voyage is complete. The ships have reached harbor. The stories have been told. And now there is only rest-deep, peaceful rest that comes after long journeying, after trials endured, after arriving finally home. Sleep well.